Chapter 10, Room for Growth.
Hey everyone, I'm Alex Honnold.
I'm Fitz.
This is Climbing Gold.
So today on Chapter 10, we are going to take a quick look back at our first season. What does it all mean? What can we learn from climbing's distant and recent history? And we talk about our next season, which looks forward into the next chapter of our sport. If you're joining us right now, none of this is going to make any sense. So if you haven't listened to season 1, I highly suggest starting at the beginning. It'll make a lot more sense. Alex, should we go ahead and jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool. Number 1, the pendulum will always swing between athleticism and adventure.
So much of climbing history, things like bolting wars and traditional ethics versus sport climbing and all those kinds of things can really be seen in the lens of athleticism versus adventure. People who think that climbing is at its heart purely adventurous, or people who want to see climbing as more of an athletic activity. 60 years ago, climbing was pretty much all adventure with a pretty low degree of athleticism. And nowadays, to climb at the most elite levels, it's incredibly athletic. But then that athleticism can be used to go on, potentially even crazier adventures.
Yeah.
The rise of gym climbing is also a perfect example of climbing sliding further along the athleticism spectrum, because climbing in the gym is very much a distillation of the athletic side of climbing. There's very little adventure in a gym, but it can be incredibly athletic.
And I immediately kind of thought of the Dawn Wall with like Tommy, putting in so much effort, and that was such a big deal for the American climbing and I think the global climbing world. Like, people paid attention to that. And then it was like so funny to kind of see Adam Ondra, who everyone's like, yeah, well, it's just Adam Ondra. He's the guy who does short sport routes and like freaks out and yells a lot. And then he basically just like shows up and does the thing, even though he hasn't even spent that much time in the valley. And like, it seemed like Adam Ondra had been on the athleticism train, but that athleticism train actually allowed him to go, step up to what we would consider to be like one of the ultimates of that sort of traditional or that sort of adventure style climbing.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, because when you think of Adam Ondra on the Dawn Wall, he climbs 3 or 4 grades harder than Tommy. And so obviously the Dawn Wall is just so much more comfortable for him. Even though it's still an incredibly hard route, one of the hardest big walls in the world, Adam Ondra comfortably climbs a full number grade harder than that. So, for him, it's just like a good adventure. He's like, oh, it's a fun trip to the valley, spend a month, do this cool route, and then go back to training for World Cups. You're like, that's so wild. But it just goes to show that standards are constantly rising.
We have seen that pendulum swing through the decades. Like, do you ever worry that this time around it won't swing back to that style that, you're really well known for?
I'm not too worried that climbing is going to swing fully to the athletic side of the spectrum and sort of leave adventure behind, because I think that there will always be a tension between the two. And I think that anytime it swings too far one way or the other, there will always be some sort of countercultural climbers that decide to pursue the other end of the spectrum. It seems like right now, recently, climbing is getting more athletic and less adventurous. It seems like climbers are slightly more risk averse. And that makes sense, because most climbers learn how to climb in a gym now, where, by definition, there's no danger. But I think that just creates this incredible opportunity for climbers who want the adventurous side of it. And I kind of had that experience because I grew up climbing in a gym. It was all very safe, but I wanted more of an adventure from it. And so I sought that out in the form of, some of the soloing that I've done. And honestly, a lot of the climbing that I do. Even today, I went and soloed this. Wait, I didn't solo. I went and simul-climbed this multi-pitch, on this big limestone wall. I'm kind of like, I wanted to have an active rest day, have a little adventure, and so I went out and had the adventure that I wanted. The thing is that that's always available to any climber, and so it's hard to imagine that climbing will ever become too safe, because really anybody who wants to can seek out the experience that they want.
Yeah,
I don't know.
And you think, and you think that there's something that's just natively like resonant about stepping up to risk, like, right? I personally do, but I'm a dad. I coach like my kid through like looking at that as being like, should you be scared right now or should you not be? Like I try to help teach him that, just because sometimes the other day, like I found my kid like 15, my 5-year-old 15 feet up a tree, like on a sagging limb. And I was like, dude, that's a little high. You should be a little scared. And he's like, no, I'm good. And then the next day the limb snapped and he like whipped 15 feet onto his back and was like freaked out, like it was like, well, you should have listened to dad maybe, but like I didn't.
Was he was uninjured?
He was uninjured. He had like a pretty good like goose like egg on one bone. I kind of thought, I was a little worried it broke, like fractured a bone for a second. Like he definitely had like, he doesn't cry a lot and he had to cry a little bit that night, but yeah, it was okay. But it definitely was like,
I thought I broke my clavicle once falling out of a tree like that.
Oh, yeah. But it's just a classic thing where it's like, I personally think that is like a dance in life, and we take creative risks, we take physical risks, we take risks in business, we take risks in love. I think that's just part of it. But I'm curious, like, do you just think that level of kind of being like, I clearly have skin in the game, that there's something that will always be compelling?
You're saying, do I think that that's an integral part of climbing, that the risk has to be part of climbing?
Yeah, like on a level to make it deeply like interesting. Do you think it has to be a part of it? Maybe
counterintuitively, I don't really think that risk has to be a part of climbing. I mean, obviously, I've enjoyed that aspect of climbing very much, but I don't really think that everybody needs it. I think that plenty of climbers can be totally fulfilled as climbers just climbing in the gym, or, you could be an elite World Cup competitor and basically take no risk in your climbing, and yet still have your entire lifestyle revolve around training and competing and performing at an elite level as a climber. I would never say that they aren't climbing. It's like, basically, I don't think that risk has to be in climbing. I just think that it's kind of like a spice that sometimes makes the stew a little more exciting. I don't know. It's like, if you want it, add more spice, but if you don't, you don't need it. Some people like their food bland. Because they're fucking light duty.
Number 2, true pioneers don't move climbing forward, they move it sideways. Have your thoughts evolved at all, whether this is like a sport or a creative pursuit?
I think my personal opinion is that right now where we stand in climbing is that it's mostly a sport in which somebody can still express themselves creatively if they want to. But I think that climbing has definitely swung pretty far towards the athletic side right now. And that's fine, because there's still plenty of room for people to express themselves artistically or, creatively if they want to. But I think it's steadily on its way to becoming a sport.
Talking to some of the people that through their talent or through their vision have really moved the sport forward or like helped the sport grow, like Gil or Chris Sharma or even Lynn Hill, it seems that they play with both, that they actually connect those two things, where they're like, I understand there's like this athletic component to it that needs to be refined and honed and trained and like developed, but then there needs to be some other layer where it's like, I'm bored with how people are doing it and I'm going to move it up. And I'm curious, like, whether you think that's almost like the definition of a climbing legend is somebody that activates on that sort of athletic level, but then sort of says like, this whole thing, like they don't end up happy with it and they just move it forward and push it in a new way.
Not even necessarily move it forward, but push it sideways. They just do something different.
That's a really good way of thinking of it. Like the side, it's like less always forward and sometimes just sideways.
Yeah, because often it doesn't feel like they're going forward because they're doing something different than their peers. So it feels like they're taking a step in a slightly different direction. They're taking a hard left for some reason, but then it turns out that that's visionary. If you think of John Gill and bouldering, it's hard to say that he, certainly at the time, I'm sure it did not seem like he was pushing the sport forward, because everybody else is focused on climbing big mountains and he's climbing these tiny little boulders at the base of the mountains. I'm sure to his contemporaries, people were like, that guy is doing the wrong thing right now. Like, he is wasting his talent. But now looking back on it from 60 years out, we're like, wow, he was very much ahead of his time. And, now he's considered a visionary.
Yeah. I think that happened to like Chris Sharma too. Like when he kind of went down the bouldering rabbit hole and everyone's like, "What's Chris Sharma doing?"
Well, or
like
even more so with the deep water soling rabbit hole.
Yeah, totally.
You're like, why is he playing in the ocean so much? That's weird. But then he made it cool, and everyone's like, wow, now they're deep water soling competitions and things, and you're like, that's pretty cool. I think one of the challenges with climbing gold though is that sort of by definition in a 40-minute podcast, it's just hard to add the context for all those kinds of things because I just said that like Chris Sharma popularized deep water soling, and the reality is that it was already a big thing in places like Majorca where it's easily accessible and it makes total sense. And there were already like local legends doing that kind of thing. So it's like, you don't want to give full credit to one random person like Chris Sharma for making it cool. But that is kind of true in the US. I feel like with each episode, we could do an extra 2 hours of like extra context behind it, explaining like, well, this is largely true, but there was that one example of that French guy who did it first.
Yeah.
But, he's just not remembered in the same way.
Yeah, totally. And it's actually fascinating because like that's actually always true of history. Is that ideas often are grouped, and they're often like the same ideas had in different places, like globally.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Was there anyone that you wished, like of the older generation, that you like wished you could have gone climbing with?
I would love to go climb with John Gill, I think. Just because I think that beyond his incredible physical talent and the things that he did as a boulder, I think that he had a really different approach to it. I mean, and that's something that I didn't really appreciate until we got to talk to him, was just how differently he viewed climbing. And I think a lot of that comes from the gymnastic background, but just the way he thinks about movement and the way he thinks about, executing a climb. I'm just like, I don't know, it's so interesting. It'd be fun to, a session with him at the boulders.
Number 3, climbing doesn't happen in a vacuum. Greater cultural and economic factors have played a role in its growth.
My other big takeaway from the season was just how some of the trends in climbing were really just following broader cultural trends, or really how broader cultural trends affect, things in climbing.
Explain that to me.
Well, it's like, growing up in a climbing gym, I just thought of it as a gym opened. But what does that have to say with, the suburbanization of America and real estate trends and commercial real estate and even just plastic manufacturing, like all the climbing holds that I've spent my whole life climbing on. I mean, a lot of that has to do with plastics and how they're sold and marketed. It's like, or even talking about route setting. It's like, there's just a lot more to climbing than we necessarily think of. Or the public lands issues. I mean, as a climber, I've always taken the wilderness somewhat for granted without realizing that teams of people, like whole organizations, are devoted to keeping those lands open. It's like there's so much of climbing that we just take for granted.
For a long time, people found climbing,
mm-hmm.
right? It was like you read a book. Like I think of Joanne reading, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I remember Joanne reading the book as a 17-year-old in New York City, barely having ever been outdoors, and just deciding, well, I'm actually going to go spend my life like putting up first ascents and doing rad things, even though she'd never climbed. And people found climbing in that way and did that. And even when we started climbing in the gyms, right, you had to go to some strange industrial part. Like the 2 gyms in Seattle were down by like the docks and then like down in like the industrial district, where you just would never bump into them unless you knew they were there.
And even knowing that they're there, they were scary to go to.
Like slightly, right? And then
that's how the gyms in Sac were. It's like, even knowing the address, you're like, am I in the right parking lot? Like, this feels pretty intimidating. Like, is it okay to be here? Oh, jeez.
Yeah. And then you think about it, it's like, and then all of a sudden, like, those gyms were successful, and they like were like, oh, or someone spun one off, and like, well, we could put it out where all the families are, and there's like, less of a drive, and like they end up in the suburbs. And then all of a sudden it's like climbing's kind of cool, so we can actually bring this back to urban settings where like all of a sudden, you're dealing with issues of gentrification and all that. And it's just like fascinating to see how climbing, it's just sort of so easy to see it as monolithic, but really it's tied up into the greater things that are happening in our country and really in our world right now. Number 4, gyms are the new campfire.
I mean, in some ways, the climbing gym is becoming sort of the modern third space, whatever the term is for the place that isn't at home, isn't at work, like where you go to hang out with your friends. Like in the UK, that'd be going to the pub to hang with your mates, but I think in modern life, that's often the climbing gym, a place that you can see all your friends where you're not at work or at home. I definitely see the climbing gym as the modern campfire.
I hope people embrace gym climbing and all that brings out in it. Like, I hope that people build culture around that versus just like it being a workout, because I think that that's one of the sides about the last, 60 years in climbing was that it wasn't just like this adventure. It wasn't just this sport. There was like actually a culture to it, and there was like a way to connect, and there was a way to build community. And I hope that some of the older people that maybe like have been there for that can, like, I don't know, help out. And maybe the young people don't need old people at all. But like that's like one of those things I do hope that people are able to like find that community that you and I found growing up in climbing in this next version of it.
I mean, do you know anybody who refuses to go to a climbing gym?
No, but I think I have like friends that'll be like,
yeah, you always have some
like,
friend who's like curmudgeonly about it and like
yeah,
likes
or like
to complain about it.
We'll like lose interest or just being like, oh, the gym doesn't scratch that itch or whatever, which I get.
I mean, but also like even the curmudgeons, you still see them in the gym. They're just complaining about it, which you're like, yeah, that's fine. They're, it's fair to complain a little bit, but you're here because it's awesome. It's like, I don't know.
Like looking around culturally, would you say that climbing has hit the mainstream already, or is it just about to? Like, what's your read on that? Because like that's a pretty subtle, like that sort of tipping point for climbing is a somewhat subtle thing. And would you say it's hit it or not?
I think climbing is very close to hitting mainstream. And maybe when it's in the Olympics, that'll just kind of count as the moment where you're like, okay, now it's mainstream. But I mean, it's grown so much, but yeah, it may not feel exactly mainstream yet because I mean, it's not like Little League, it's not like every kid is signing up and people are doing it everywhere. And there's still huge swaths of the country that just don't have climbing gyms, full stop. So, I mean, I don't think you could quite call it mainstream yet, even though I think a lot of older climbers like to complain that it's going mainstream or that it's, that it's basically there. But realistically, I don't think it's actually mainstream yet.
After the break, we finish up our takeaways and discover one of Alex's pet peeves. Number 5, don't be nostalgic. Modern climbers have the best of both worlds. Obviously, in the foreseeable future, I think everyone is anticipating, the quote-unquote Olympic bump. But if you look at it and you say to yourself, like, is this going to keep growing or is this going to keep rising? Like, what do you think about that?
I think climbing is definitely here to stay. I think it might not continue to experience the same kind of growth forever, just because at some point it'll plateau. But climbing is such an elemental movement pattern. I mean, it's pleasing to do. It's it feels good in the same way that running is here to stay. I mean, people will always go running because, to some degree, your body is made to do that kind of thing. And climbing is the same way. I mean, the facilities are nicer, the community is nice. It's like, yeah, it's hard to imagine climbing contracting.
And it's crazy to think, like, from a running standpoint, it sort of seems like, hey, everyone runs. And particularly like during the pandemic, there's a huge growth in running. But it's also kind of wild to think that if you go back to the 70s, like running was fringe then too.
That's not that far off from stories of original climbing gyms. People gluing climbing holds onto the bottom of underpasses and like climbing in these really fringe places, climbing on abutments to bridges and things. It's like, yeah, I mean, it used to be really not cool. and then eventually people start to understand it and then they realize it's actually quite fun.
It's funny too, like, because I think there is a side of listening to some of these stories, like particularly Joanne Uriosty and Red Rock, like hearing her just be like, this place was empty. And it's like hard not to feel slightly nostalgic. And I certainly didn't know Red Rock the way that, like that emptiness wasn't there. I get it. But it makes me, I guess I have two questions for you. Is like, what about the good old days strikes you as incredible? Like, what do you kind of like looking back at some of these stories, like, are there parts of it that you wished you'd been a part of?
I mean, not really. Like, I've never been particularly nostalgic about the good old days or the golden era of climbing in Yosemite or any of those kinds of things, because I love free climbing. I love having good bolts. I love having ropes that don't occasionally break. You know, I mean, I guess they do occasionally break, but not really. Basically, I love modern climbing hardware and the safety that it brings. And, you know, I mean, I understand how you could be nostalgic for that emptiness, you know, like of totally untouched ranges and the opportunity that brings to put up first ascents and have wild adventures. But the reality is that opportunity still exists in huge parts of the world. And I mean, you can go have those experiences if you're willing to travel a little bit and venture off the beaten path. So, you know, like I personally really like modern Red Rock because I like that the routes have chalk on them and that they're buffed out and that they're clean and they have rappel anchors and that, you know, that way I can have a really pleasant climbing experience if I want it, or I can have a tremendous adventure if I want that too by enchaining, you know, different mountains and, you know, questing off route or putting up new routes. It's like, I don't know. I mean, the thing is, in the good old days, you know, the Uriostes could only have adventures in Red Rock because that was the only thing that was available. But, you know, nowadays you can have a really intense athletic experience, or you can have a tremendous adventure depending on which you prefer that day. And I kind of prefer having the option. Everybody glamorizes the good old days or like, you know, the adventure of it. But it's like, I mean, do you want to hand drill every single bolt that you clip? Like, do you want to have to hammer pitons all the time? Do you want your rack to weigh 50 pounds all the time and your rope to weigh 1,000,000 pounds and then also to worry that your rope is going to break if you actually fall on it? Or for that matter, do you want to be hanging in slings all the time? Like, I don't know if you've ever climbed anything in slings, like wearing, you know, basically without a seated harness, but it's incredibly uncomfortable and it chafes in terrible ways. I mean, everything about the climbing experience is physically more pleasant nowadays. And I'm kind of like, you know, I like that. I mean, even things like plastic water bottles, you know, imagine climbing before plastic. You're sort of like, oh, you're taking like a full-on like flask up the mountain and things like that. Like, it's all so heavy and there are no technical snacks. You know, you're taking like a metal flask with like a salami with you or something. One of the big tensions in climbing, or particularly the growth of climbing, is crowding and access. And basically old climbers complaining that, you know, their favorite crag is too crowded now, or there are too many people climbing nowadays. And that's actually one of my biggest pet peeves, because you're kind of like, well, you are the crowd. Like, you are part of that crowd. So it's like, if it's bothering you, just don't be there and don't contribute to that problem. You know, there's so much rock in the world. It's like, there's no real point in complaining that climbing's getting too crowded. You can always just go a little bit further from the car if you need to, or climb at a slightly less popular area, or, you know, make a new area. You know, it's like, there's plenty of untapped rock all over.
Number 6, we're athletically mature and culturally adolescent. There's room to grow, and that's exciting. You know, so if I had to pick a central theme or single word to sum up season 1, I'd pick the word growth. And that word, that can obviously mean a lot of different things, and we've talked about it in terms of numbers, whether that's the number of participants or the grades. But we've also talked about growth on a deeper level. There was one clip from Aaron Mike in chapter 9 about Navajo lands. Here, I'll play it right now, and it really stood out to me.
So in any industry or any sport, there's always, you know, kind of an evolution timeline, right? And obviously in climbing, we've had the technical evolution side, meaning, you know, gear is at a point right now where it's efficient, it's available, it's simple. We have practices in place. On the technical side, climbing it's not at a maturity level, it's almost there. The other side that doesn't necessarily increase with it, but is an area where, you know, evolution is necessary, is the social side of climbing, the communal side of climbing. And what I mean by that is the social responsibility that comes with it, the ethics which we all decide as a community what's appropriate and what's not.
The moment I heard him say that, I kind of was like, maybe he's right. Maybe we have like a lot to grow. And I was curious what you thought of that.
hopefully the cultural changes in climbing keep a pace with the technical changes and the physical changes. I mean, it'd be interesting if the way we talk and think about climbing changed as quickly as the way we're actually able to climb, because like difficulty standards have increased so quickly, and yet the stories that we tell ourselves as climbers seem like they're changing more slowly.
Yeah. It's almost like we need new stories.
I kind of think it really just has to do with the acceptance that climbing is growing up and you're just not allowed to do whatever you want anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the nature of growing up, is that you just have to be responsible about things.
It reminds me that one thing I've been meaning to do is to join Memphis Rocks, even though I don't live in Memphis, or to become a stating member.
You can, I'm a recurring donor. I mean, you should just sign up as a donor.
And just do it that way?
Yeah, don't be a member. Just become a donor.
Okay, cool. Like that, I'm not a multitasker, but that is on my list, and that will happen because that's like just something I'm just like, that is just such a good idea. Like I just was like, this is a good idea.
I know, totally.
And it's like, I don't know. I'm sure someone out there is gonna pick apart that idea or like say everything, but I'm just like, fuck it. That's truly a good idea. Like I'm just gonna go like out there and just be like, I don't know what the like I mean, maybe there is some drawback to that approach or to that model or whatever that we'll find out in the future. But I'm like, at least let's try new ideas to continue to like build this community in a way, because I think you said in that episode, but I am concerned sometimes that this could turn into the country club. I look at it and I see the sport and I see it growing rapidly, and I think that like a lot of times like businesses, when they're doing something, the way that they do it is they just raise prices. And I can kind of see this version of this story where that it feels more like tennis or golf than this sport's for everyone. And I don't know, like I guess I like worry about that, and I'm curious whether you do or not.
Well, I definitely don't see that. I mean, I think that climbing gyms, already what we've seen with the growth of gyms is just that more people participate in climbing across the board. And we've definitely seen that with gender, because 30 years ago, climbing was mostly men, and now it's very evenly split. I mean, especially indoors. And you definitely see that across all kinds of groups of people, because as gyms enter, different parts of the country and different parts of cities, you just wind up with a wider swath of people trying out the sport. And so, I mean, I think when you look at a cross-section of climbers in America today, it's wildly different than it was, I was going to say 30 or 40 years ago, but it's wildly different than it was 10 years ago even. And so, I mean, there's definitely no evidence that climbing is becoming more like a country club. I mean, if anything, climbing is becoming more like a music festival or something, it's becoming more inclusive. It feels like we're just like everybody shows up. I mean, gyms are just opening everywhere. And so you just wind up with all kinds of folks getting to try it out. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to think about climbing in relation to a global mega sport like soccer, or football in the rest of the world. A sport that's so popular and so easy to try that it's attracted talent from literally anywhere. So the people playing professional football, like professional soccer, are the best in the world for sure, because almost anybody everywhere on earth has kicked a ball around and had some opportunity to develop their skill. So when you see people performing at an elite level, you know that they really represent the best humans on earth at that particular skill. And climbing is not even remotely close to that point yet, because most people have never even tried climbing. And so I'm kind of excited for more people to try it, just because we'll wind up seeing so much more ability. We'll just see incredible things happen in climbing.
After the break, we look forward and talk season 2 of Climbing Gold. Yeah, there's going to be a season 2. We've gotten through this first season. Obviously we have not done the definitive history of climbing by any means. We've never pretended to do that. But, in this first season, I think we definitely focused on, the past up really to the present. And I think that in this next part that we're going to do, that'll release in, a little bit from now, is we want to look at the future. And I think what we hope to get everyone to is this point of understanding, because there's clearly a big thing about to happen to our sport. And like, it may not matter to some people, but the Olympics are gonna matter to a lot of people in the world, because that's just what the Olympics are. And so just from your standpoint, like, what are you curious? Like, we're going to dive into this. We're going to dive into competition. We're going to dive into some of the things that surround this next chapter in climbing, which, in theory could really take place on walls created from people's imaginations versus found in nature. What are you thinking about it?
I think it's totally natural that the Olympics are at the center of our attention right now, and that competition climbing is so interesting for the sport. And I think for at least the next, 5-10 years, it seems like competition climbing is going to be sort of the leading edge of the sport, just because it's going to be attracting new people, attracting new sponsors and new advertisers, all this kind of stuff. It's like it probably is going to be sort of the growth driver for climbing for the foreseeable, for the next decade. And yet, even as that happens, it's like already I can kind of see a time slightly past that when you have people who maybe didn't quite qualify for the Olympics, or just like aren't quite interested in competition, but who still train in the same ways, have access to the same facilities, and climb at the same level, who are out doing, what they want, which is perhaps the adventurous side of climbing, putting up crazy new routes and at an incredibly high standard in various parts of the world. I don't know. I'm kind of like, it makes sense that the Olympics are going to be sort of driving the sport for the next little bit. But I really think that will swing back the other way and just enable the next round of adventure, basically. And personally, that's what I'm more interested in. I'm kind of curious what today's Olympians will do in 5 or 10 years when they don't qualify for the next Olympics, but they're still some of the best climbers in the world. And they're like, you know what? I'm sick of training in the gym. I want to do something really exciting.
Really, the U.S. hasn't had a team until just recently.
And definitely not a well-supported team.
Yeah. And that's changing, and there are some countries that have that. There are some countries that don't. It's kind of all over the board, but I think that what we're looking at is that it's not just the story about these athletes. It's a story about the infrastructure that comes behind them and some of how that changes it. And I think that we're going to be, some of the people I'm really excited to talk to are the people that route set, that create that. They're almost like the unseen competitors in the whole thing. I think there's the side of the gyms that's pretty interesting, some of the business side of it. I think there's the level that goes into actually creating a team around a sport that typically, in its last, few decades has been definitely driven by individuals. And it's interesting because like we used to have teams, when people would go to the Himalaya to like do some first ascent of an 8,000 meter peak, they went as teams, right? And that's very much faded away from our sport. And there's just so many interesting questions that I think this brings up. And frankly, like, I don't know about you, but I find the Olympics as a whole an interesting institution.
Like interesting in a good way?
Like interesting in that they're like such a powerful platform. They are such a powerful platform, and there's incredible moments. Like there's just undeniably, as a fan of sports and someone who loves like athletic competition and the nuance of it, it's like undeniable. There's something about the Olympics that just
it brings out the best in human performance.
It really does,
amazing.
And that's something that's like worthy. And then there's all these other sides to it, which are like way trickier. And that's like the story of humanity, realistically. But I think
the commercialization, the exploitation, all that kind of stuff. Like, does it corrupt the sport? Yeah.
Alex, I'm curious, like, how many times you've been asked whether or not you're gonna, or like back in the, like earlier when the qualifications, like whether you were gonna be in the Olympics or not.
No, anytime I do some kind of corporate speaking or like public event, people are like, oh, so you're going to be in the Olympics, right? I'm like, no, I'm old, I'm weak, I'm slow compared to the Olympians. It's like, come on.
We just came back from doing a bunch of reporting for season 2. And we were in Salt Lake, we were a team with Team USA. And I have my questions about the Olympics. And I have like my questions of whether or not climbing needs the Olympics or whether the Olympics need climbing, and it's probably both, but we're going to get into that. But I guess like there was a level of it where I'm really interested to see what happens. And this next season we're going to dive in, and I'm curious, like, are you excited? Like, the Olympics are coming up. It's about to happen. Like, after this last trip, like, are you fired up to
to go dive into season 2?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm fired up for the Olympics. I don't know why you're such a... Well, no, I know why you're a curmudgeon because you're older. But no, the Olympics is showcasing climbing athleticism at its finest. I mean, what's not to be excited about seeing the best climbers in the world compete on the biggest stage and showcasing their talent, basically? No, I'm super psyched for that. I mean, in the same way that it's fun to watch World Cups, except in this case, it's just even, it's just a whole different degree. And I mean, it's never been done before. I mean, it'll be just fun to see the spectacle of it. Isn't the goal of the Olympics to bring the world together through sport? I mean, it's just cool to see so many countries together, showcasing the finest in human talent. I mean, I kind of love seeing any human do something really well, and that could be like chopping vegetables really, really quickly or precisely. It's like, I just like seeing excellence. And I mean, really, when you watch the Olympics, all you're seeing is excellence.
The field that's about to arrive there in terms of like strength, like obviously there's a lot of different skills in climbing, but in terms of strength, like the field that's about to arrive there, like where does it stand against like a lot of the climbers we've talked about on the first season, like Tommy Caldwell, Chris Sharma, you, like all of that, like in terms of the people that we often gravitate towards and think of like, oh, that person is like at the forefront, like where are these people at athletically right now?
The entire field of competitors appearing in the Olympics they're all far beyond any of the folks that we've chatted with throughout season 1. I mean, you talk about Lynn Hill being the first woman to climb 514. That was groundbreaking at the time, and yet the qualifying routes now for the Olympics are at least 14A. So I mean, the women in the Olympics, are expecting to onsite 14A. It's like a completely different standard than Lynn was climbing in her time. And, I mean, and same with the men. It's like the qualification routes, when we talked to Chris Sharma, we talked about him putting up Necessary Evil, the first 14C in the country. I mean, 14C is a common grade in competition now for lead World Cups. People should be onsitting that grade in order to make semifinals or to make finals. And so, I mean, the standards have just completely changed over the last 20 years. Actually, another way to look at it is that 20 years ago, any strong climber could have a pretty good shot in a competition. And that's kind of how somebody like Chris Sharma won a World Cup in his time, because he was one of the strongest climbers in the world. And so he could just kind of show up and win comps. And that's just not the case anymore. Because now, you can be a really strong climber, but if you're not practicing competition climbing all the time, you're just not even going to be able to read the movement. Like the problems are too tricky. The setting is counterintuitive. There's a whole dynamic element to it that rivals parkour, where you have to like run and jump and bounce and catch things. I mean, just being a strong climber is not enough anymore. You have to be one of the strongest climbers in the world and incredibly skilled at this particular style of competing.
Do you get the sense we're looking at the future?
Well, I think we're definitely looking at the future of competition climbing. I mean, we'll see how that applies to climbing in general. Yeah,
that's like the $1 million question right there.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of what we've been exploring and what we'll continue to explore through season 2 is, like as the athletic side of climbing charges into the future, what does that mean for the adventure side? Like what does that mean for the rest of climbing?
Climbing Gold is a production of Duct Tape and Beer. Alex Honnold is our host. The show has been written and edited by me, Fitz. I could not have done that without our senior producer, Elizabeth Nicotto, who provided additional editing and guidance. Along the way, we got extra help editing and writing from Alex Park and Andrew Burton, additional editing and mixing by Cordelia Zars, who also collaborated with me to compose music for the show. Brendan O'Connell and Amy Stolzenbach provided music. Art direction and social media by Anya Miller. Our executive producers are Jonathan Redsick and Ben Endy for RXR Sports, and Lizzie Hendricks and Becca Cahal for Duct Tape and Beer. Thanks for listening.